Thanks so much, and good morning, everyone. It's an absolute honor to be here, especially in person, to introduce somebody who has served our country and our world, for that matter, with great distinction. Bob Zoellick has led such an accomplished and multifaceted career that I'll only be able to scratch the surface of his achievements in my introduction. From 1985 to 1993, he served as counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury and Undersecretary of State, as well as White House Deputy Chief of Staff. He was U.S. Trade Representative from 2001 to 2005 and Deputy Secretary of State from 2005 to 2006. He then served as President of the World Bank Group from 2007 to 2012, providing leadership during one of the most difficult economic periods in history. He is currently Senior Counselor at Brunswick Geopolitical and has been a Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government since 2012. He serves on a number of prominent boards and councils and also holds additional leadership positions in humanitarian and service-based domains. Among his many accolades, Bob is a recipient of the Distinguished Service Award, the Department of State's highest honor, as well as the Alexander Hamilton Award of the Department of Treasury and the Medal for Distinguished Public Service of the Department of Defense. He is a renowned scholar and in 2020 published his book, America and the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. We are very fortunate to be hearing from someone who so perfectly embodies the foundation's ideals of public service and integrity. With that said, please join me in welcoming Bob Zoellick.
Well, thanks, Jason, for that very warm introduction. I don't know if you book for memorial events. I don't have a particular day, but maybe sort of keep in mind the possibility. It's a particular privilege to be here with all of you because having worked with Don Rumsfeld, I can see why this program would have been especially close to his heart. To be blunt, as Don Rumsfeld would be, he liked smart people, but he also liked people who worked hard. And as you heard in the opening remarks from Tori and others, he wanted to encourage people who did their homework, sort of were pushing intellectual edges, to engage in the rough and tumble of public service. And it is rough and tumble, as his sort of career demonstrated and showed. And so his team would probably know this well. Part of working with Don was he was always testing. He was always trying to sharpen people. It wasn't done in a hostile way. It was done in a way that was trying to encourage them to kind of grow and sort of ask questions that they might not have asked. And I always appreciated that he also did it with, as you heard, sort of a wit and sense of humor and teasing along the way. So I think this program is a wonderful development of the Rumsfeld Foundation. I'm glad that you're doing it in a way that you can interact with one another over time to sort of get the benefit of it. And so I also want to thank the people who've been part of this with Tori and with Sarah and with Courtney in particular. Now, I thought, since you're going to be discussing some current events today, and the program you have is really a superb one, I wanted to begin with a historical foundation, but linked to the world of policymaking. So I need to step back a few years, 243 to be precise, to the evening of February 6th, 1778. So Ben Franklin had just arrived at the French Foreign Ministry to sign America's very first two treaties. And he was approached by a colleague, Silas Deane, that asked about his somewhat unusual dress. It was worn suit of blue Manchester velvet. And Franklin replied, "A bit of revenge." So it turned out that 4 years before, Franklin had been in London, as some of you may know, where he was representing Massachusetts and 3 other colonies. And Franklin had sent copies of the Massachusetts governor's private correspondence to Boston, to the Assembly, and it stirred up a hornet's nest. because in a way, Franklin was one of the first whistleblowers, because the correspondence embarrassed the royal governors in terms of their attitudes towards the people of Massachusetts. So the government of George III summoned Franklin before the Privy Council. It took place in a room that was called the cockpit, because that's what it had served at under Henry VIII. And Franklin was ordered to stand before 30 bewigged gentlemen of the Privy Council. And England's Solicitor General, a man named Alexander Wedderburn, began to subject Franklin to a blistering attack for an hour. And Franklin stood motionless, not a word. In the small society of London of this age, this was just an utter humiliation. So Edmund Burke later just responded, he said, this is beyond all bounds and measures. Lord Shelburne, who would turn out to be the British First Minister, later called Prime Minister at the time of the peace treaty that gave America its independence, called it scurrilous invective. Franklin himself said, this is bull baiting. Well, that of course turned Franklin, a loyal friend of Britain, into a determined enemy. So, 4 years later, in 1778 in Paris, Franklin wore the same suit that he had worn when he was dressed down in the cockpit. So the message here is diplomacy can include settling scores. Now, it turns out that Franklin's private secretary was a British spy. And so he had sent these two treaties to London, allegedly within 42 hours, and he'd even shorted the market. So diplomacy also includes deceit and scoundrels. Now, I begin this story in the introduction to the book that we're all giving you because, of course, it's an amusing way to draw readers in. But if you reflect a little bit on the Franklin story and his diplomacy in Paris and London, think about some of the insights that may be applicable to today. So Franklin's major task was to negotiate from war to peace. And that's a major challenge that continues to be on our agenda. Witness the story of Afghanistan. Franklin had a relatively weak hand to play. And that struck me because a couple of years ago when Mattis was Secretary of Defense, he made this observation and said, the United States no longer has total domain dominance. Well, in much of history, America didn't have total domain dominance. And the question is, how do you use what you have shrewdly? Franklin really was the inventor of public diplomacy. The US was unknown in 1778, but Franklin was a world-famous figure, and he used that to represent this new society. He became a popular figure, and his image appeared everywhere. It appeared on sort of rings, it appeared on sort of amulets, it appeared in all different forms, and to the point where Louis XVI at some point got a little envious, and he presented a Franklin fan a chamber pot with Franklin's picture at the bottom to try to sort of get some counterpoint. Franklin had to negotiate with his own delegation. He did so quite effectively with John Jay. With John Adams, he observed, he said, Adams is always an honest man, often a very thoughtful man, but in some cases and in some circumstances, absolutely out of his senses. And for those of you that end up in public service, you'll find this to be your experience with some of your colleagues. Franklin had to negotiate with allies and with Congress. He had been ordered by Congress, he and his fellow delegates, not to achieve a treaty with Britain without France's assent. They decided this was not a very wise course. But then it was left to Franklin to try to come to terms with France after sort of breaking this promise. And on top of it, Franklin had to ask for another loan. And you'll see in my book the comments that he makes, which is just a wonderful example of a shrewd and effective diplomat. And then one of the other aspects that I think that continues to today is after achieving this amazing success, the Treaty of 1783, which gave us all the territory to the Mississippi River, was a fantastic achievement. One of his colleagues, Henry Lawrence, said, well, I'm sure you will appreciate the gratitude of your country for the rest of your years. And Franklin says, I've never known a peace without its critics. And he said, so the Bible's direction about blessed are the peacemakers may apply to the next life, not to this one. So I wanted to share with you this opening to give you a little sense of what this book is about. The book takes a slightly different approach than for those of you that have been interested in international affairs, because I try to tell the stories of how leading Americans sought to address the foreign policy problems of their eras, starting with Ben Franklin and going up to George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41 in 89-92. So I'm focusing on people in particular episodes, stories, because I wanted to emphasize and highlight the practical problem-solving work of diplomacy. And I also add some of my own assessments based on experience and insights on the conduct of diplomacy. Along the way, I try to draw out a series of ideas that have contributed to the pluralism of American diplomacy over 200 years, and I identify 5 traditions. And then for some of you that have just finished your graduate work, you'll be pleased to know I had a seminar also of faculty and graduate students at Harvard that would review my drafts with me, and they said, you can't end with 1992. So I added an afterword where I looked at these 5 traditions at the presidencies of Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, and a little bit of Trump. And this is perhaps an idea that you can use with your work. I recalled that Richard Neustadt, who'd written the book Presidential Power, kept writing additional afterwords for additional editions, and you can get, the multiple afterwords. So I thought rather than have a closing chapter, I'd use an afterword and maybe encourage my publishers to have additional volumes going forward. So, and this is particularly relevant for this group. So why did I write the book? Frankly, I wrote the book in large part for people like you, because when I was in government, I drew upon history as I was trying to think through problems. And I wanted to encourage others, particularly the next generation. As all of you are probably well aware, many foreign policy courses these days focus on international relations theories. Well, those are fun to debate. They're intellectually challenging. But what I'm trying to convey was that in my experience, whether it was dealing with German unification or trade strategy or China policy or genocide in Darfur or the World Bank and development issues, the relevance, was a little bit peripheral. And so what I wanted to convey was the reality of people doing practical problem solving, but with some of the detail that really goes into these questions as opposed to sort of general sort of thematic ideas of how people approach foreign policy. Some of you may know that Henry Kissinger wrote a book titled Diplomacy in the 1990s, where he used history to talk about foreign policy. But in particular, given his perspective, he tended to focus on the realpolitik perspective coming out of a European tradition. And I wanted this book to also show the pluralism of American ideas and experience. There was another aspect, again, that relates to this audience. When I was in various government positions, I would often have younger colleagues, and I would ask them questions about history because I honestly didn't know what they had learned in school. I suppose I might have tortured them a little bit. But in the process, what I discovered was if they had learned history, it tended to be from World War II on. And one of the aspects of this book and my own experience was the first 150 years of American history are full of fascinating people and events that we don't want to lose to the distant part of history. So let me just give you a little flavor of this, and then we get into questions. You could pursue it further if you want. The first chapter, and Henry and I would like this, I start with Alexander Hamilton. Because I wanted to start with the Secretary of Treasury, not the Secretary of State. And I was trying to focus on the importance of economic statecraft to our diplomacy. With Thomas Jefferson, I look at the Louisiana Purchase, and I try to say, was he lucky or was he good? How did this really come apart? Many of you, of course, know that there's bookshelves full of books on the Civil War about battles and generals and slavery and now social effects. There's almost nothing written about the foreign policy of the Civil War. And yet, if Britain and France had intervened, as they could have, it would have been a very, very different history. And there was a real danger of that at a number of times. Many people, insofar as they know about Teddy Roosevelt, associate him with San Juan Hill or the Great White Fleet. I focus on the event that earned him the Nobel Peace Prize, which was the mediation of the Russo-Japanese War and then the first Moroccan crisis. And I use this to explain how mediation occurs. And Roosevelt, even though he was a person of projecting power, was an extremely skilled mediator. We were just starting to develop our diplomatic service, and he, in a sense, creates his own network to make this happen. But there was a bigger issue behind this, which is that Roosevelt was concerned that the great power tensions at the turn of the 20th century could easily lead to a conflagration and a world war, which of course within a decade it does on another peripheral part of Europe, in the Balkans, as opposed to the Moroccan situation. So for Roosevelt, the mediation was important in trying to maintain a broader balance of power. After World War I and Woodrow Wilson's failed effort at the Versailles Treaty, in 1921 and 22, a man named Charles Evans Hughes negotiated a naval arms control agreement. But again, one of the important parts often overlooked, it was linked to a regional security strategy in Northeast Asia. Now, many of you probably never even heard of Charles Evans Hughes. It turned out he almost won the presidency in 1916. He just lost California by about 3,600 votes. Otherwise, he would have been president in 1916. He later becomes a very successful Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And it's fascinating to see how he is trying to deal with arms control, diplomatic momentum, but also connected to the regional security issues in East Asia in the early 20s. Now, that may seem distant, but if you frankly think about efforts to negotiate and deal with North Korean nuclear arms or Iranian nuclear arms, one of the messages is you really need to put this in the context of the regional security policy and see how these areas are connected. I have a chapter on a man named Vannevar Bush, and you won't find him in most foreign policy studies. He, in effect, was the godfather of American science and technology policy in World War II and afterwards. And I wanted to include him because I think that his contributions in what at Stanford is called the triple helix, because he was focused on basic scientific research by the government, linked to universities and the private industrial sector, was fundamental in the US success versus the Soviet Union. And not surprisingly, this is an issue you're going to see in the papers today about dealing with China and science and technology policies. But there was another aspect as well, which was that if you think about many of the diplomatic foreign policy issues of today, climate change, pandemics, biological security, they're going to involve a combination of science and diplomacy. And how will these be connected? And what's our experience in trying to do this? How to try to think about this? And then I have chapters on more recent times, at least relatively. So with John F. Kennedy, I look at his role as a crisis manager. He actually started out with a number of mistakes, as some of you may know, but he had this ability to learn. And it comes to sort of a critical point with what historians now recognize was the combination of a Berlin and Cuban crisis and how he does that. I have a chapter on LBJ and the decisions in late 1964, early 1965 to take over the ground war by the US in Vietnam. Now, this is well-traveled historical ground. Fred Lugewald at Harvard's done a lot of work on this. So in this chapter, more than others, I try to take my experience and say, well, what went wrong with the process? Or what can we learn in this? And I identify 6 factors. And if you get a chance to read that chapter, ask how those factors might apply to sort of more recent issues. With Nixon and Kissinger, I focus on China and the realpolitik tradition. With Ronald Reagan, which Dr. Na has been sort of very involved with, I look at his speeches because many foreign policy and historians still have a difficulty understanding Reagan. And what I discovered was that he's very much a self-taught man. And he wrote his own remarks for decades and decades, and he used that to think through problems and issues. And these speeches are quite important in understanding how he saw the Cold War as a battle of ideas. But he was also a negotiator. And this was another important part because Secretary Shultz in foreign policy, James Baker, my former boss on economic policy, domestic and international, engaged Reagan in that process. And then I have a chapter on President Bush 41, George H.W. Bush, as an alliance leader at the end of the Cold War. In some ways, as you, again, read and think about the challenges of alliance leadership today, there's a lot to be learned from the leaders who actually manage this effectively. Now, while I use stories and accounts to try to give the meat of the book, I do try to pull it together with 5 traditions. And I'll close with just touching on these because they're a little different from the ones you might have encountered with your own study of foreign policy or the histories. First, the importance of North America. Now, it's interesting. If you go on foreign policy websites of institutions, you'll see a lot about Asia and Europe and usually Latin America, the Middle East, some on Africa, almost nothing on North America. But North America was, of course, critical in the 19th century. I argue it was very important in the 20th century as well. We almost went to war again with Mexico in 1916. Some of you may know the story of how the Germans proposed to the Mexicans in 1917 that if they joined in fighting a war against the United States, they could recover New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. For some reason, they left out California. I don't know what they had planned for that. And then, of course, as you think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the critical nuclear showdown in the 20th century, it's off in the Caribbean. But again, I found an observation that Reagan made in 1979 to be very powerful. So in the speech he gave opening his campaign, this is almost unbelievable today, he said, you know, it's time that we recognize that we'd be better off with Mexico and Canada being stronger than weaker, and it's time that we stop thinking about our nearest neighbors as foreigners. That's a little different than the rhetoric we've had on North America over the past few years. So one point about this that I try to convey is some of you will have known about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, renegotiated now as the USMCA. This was about much more than a trade agreement. It was recognizing that the old corporate estate led by the PRI in Mexico, formed in the 20s, was starting to break down. And the question was, where would the pieces reconnect? Whether with organized crime networks, with other types of dangerous forces, or could we connect them more in the North American context? And that work continues. Because if you think about what the American public suggests they're interested in foreign policy, you'll often have issues like immigration, environment, economics, organized crime, and narcotics criminal networks. And that's, of course, part of the North American agenda. But there's another point, going back to this Reagan observation, which is I have always seen North America as the continental base for the United States in the projection of its influence abroad. So as opposed to just thinking of how do you manage some of the difficulties with Mexico, I like to think of a continent of about 500 million people, 3 democracies, better demographics than the rest of the world if we treat our labor force and human beings as a form of capital and invest in it, energy self-sufficiency, ability to export, and ability to cooperate on a whole series of issues. So a strong base at home will be fundamental to our global position. The second tradition is trade, transnationalism, and technology. And what I was trying to emphasize in this is best, again, conveyed by an anecdote. Many of you may recall that John Adams served with Thomas Jefferson on the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence, 1776. Well, John Adams chaired his own committee at that point, and it was to draft the Model Treaty of 1776. It's basically a trade agreement. Now, what was behind that was the notion that, recall, in 1776, this is a world of empires. It's a world of mercantilism. And the American logic of this treaty was it wanted to pry open government space for private actors, whether at that point sort of merchants, later sort of missionaries, soldiers of fortune, engineers, civil society groups, NGOs. An important part of understanding America in the world is this space for private actors. And I think that continues to be the case today. So trade is about more than economic efficiency. I've always been a strong sort of free trader, and I believe there's important economic benefits, but I'm trying to underscore, as you think about the U.S. role in the world today, kind of where does trade fit in our relationship with other countries? The third tradition is one of alliances, and this has very strong two faces. So for the first 150 years of the United States, as you may recall, after Washington's warning about no permanent alliances, Jefferson about no entangling alliances, America wants to stay clear of alliances because alliances were associated with the monarchs, the militarism, the balance of power of Europe. And indeed, if you go through these chapters that I sort of, some that I mentioned, some that I didn't, you can almost see that what the U.S. is trying to do is figure out how will it relate to the world without a formal alliance structure. Economics, sort of international law systems, arms control, something that's been a little lost in our historical studies. For those of you who'd studied early American history, you'll encounter this. There was almost a mystical feeling about the importance of the Union in the United States before the Civil War and after the Civil War. With the success of preserving the Union and eliminating slavery, this affected people's idea about models of perhaps confederation. But in 1947, 1949, there's a sharp shift. And all of a sudden, America invents a new type of alliance system. And building on my thesis of pragmatism, this was not planned. By the time you read it in textbooks, you get a sense of this great architectural design. In 1947, the United States wanted to avoid a military alliance relationship with Europe, and the Marshall Plan was really designed to provide economic support and avoid the military contribution. However, in a very practical way, the founders of the Marshall Plan recognized it wouldn't work without Germany. The German economy was too critical. And this led, if you think about it in historical terms, 1945, the defeat of Nazi Germany. By 1949, the United States is supporting a federal republic of Germany. That's pretty quick. Now, that led to the third part, which is the Soviets responded with the Berlin blockade. You had the Berlin airlift. And so to deal with both the threat to the east, but also some uncertainty among Western Europeans, particularly France, about returning Germany to the world of nations, you led to the North Atlantic Alliance. So this was a classic case of people trying to deal with the problems of their day and starting to create the foundations for this alliance system. Now, Don Rumsfeld and I, in a different way, and others in this room, we lived through that 70 years of alliance system, and it always had to adjust. So, for example, how far does the security guarantee extend? Does it extend to West Berlin? Are you willing to have a nuclear exchange for West Berlin? Does it extend to Vietnam? What are the limits of the U.S. commitment to these issues? And these are the topics that obviously we're still debating today. And under my belief, there's an important economic component of this as well, as I suggested with the second tradition. The fourth tradition is the importance of congressional and public support. This one is often overlooked by foreign policy specialists as well. When you read Kennan's comments about the Congress, you can see why Dean Acheson never wanted to let him up there. He would just alienate the heck out of everybody. But the important part of this is that I use Senator Vandenberg in the 47-49 period as sort of an example of how he worked with the Truman administration, very practical ways to build the congressional support. But more recently, you would have people like McCain or Lugar, and one of the issues today is, who will play that role in Congress going forward? And fifth and finally, I talk about the tradition of America's purpose. I didn't use the term exceptionalism because as I was discussing this book again with some seminars, some friends from allied countries sort of bristled at the notion because of course they like to feel they're exceptional as well. But there is an underlying notion of purpose. And the best anecdote I can give you to help remember this is that for those of you that still carry wallets, someday take out a wallet and look at the back of a dollar bill. And you probably never examined it very closely, but that's the Great Seal of the United States. And on the reverse side of the Great Seal, you'll see this unfinished pyramid. Notice, it's unfinished. Above it is the Eye of Providence, and below it is the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. So from the very start, the founders of the United States were thinking in bigger terms. Now, it's my thesis that the notion of this purpose evolves and changes over time. So at the start, it was simply to preserve a republic in a world of empires. By mid-century, it's to preserve the Union, Lincoln's last best hope. By the turn of the 20th century, as I mentioned, you've got the United States as a rising power. How does it fit with the balance of power? For Woodrow Wilson, it was to make the world safe for democracies. Now recall, he didn't say make everything into democracy, make it safe for democracy. For Franklin Roosevelt, it's the four freedoms. During the Cold War, it's the leader of the free world. For Bill Clinton, it's the indispensable power. And there's always three components that seem to be part of this. One, of course, is what's the international environment in which you're operating. Second is what will the American public support? How will they engage in this? And that's a critical task of foreign policy leadership. But third, also some notion of an aspiration for freedom or small r republicanism, some larger purpose that is part of our being. And I'll just close with the point, as you think about the debate going on today or the debate you'll have during the course of this day, you can hear the echoes of these in the course of today, thinking about the Biden administration. So perhaps that's a good place to stop and try to take some of your questions.
Thank you. I'm John Chorchiari from the University of Michigan. It's an honor to meet you, sir. My question is about the fourth of your 5 themes and the relationship between pragmatism and populism. How concerned are you at present that populist political trends on both left and right in this country are eroding the capacity of leaders to be able to engage in pragmatic decision-making of the type that you analyze in the book?
Well, because I take things in a historical perspective, until recently, I was always a little skeptical of the doomsayers because I could go back to other times in American history. Even in my life, 1968 was a pretty nasty year. Having said that, over the past few years, sort of my native optimism has been tested, and I do think the splits in the society are increasingly dangerous. But having said that, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs does an annual survey of public attitudes towards foreign policy, and it's worth taking a close look at. The percentage of Americans that believe we should engage in the world is about 68%. And there's also about 68% that say we should do so in cooperation with others, sort of not just try to act in a hegemonic fashion. The support for NATO is like 73%, and frankly, it's up a little bit from during some of the Cold War period. In the area of trade and globalization, you see people understand the benefits in the 70s, 78, but at the same time, it's important to recognize these are all inchoate attitudes. And part of the challenge of leadership is how do you shape them? And frankly, I think one of the lessons I have from history is it's often how you respond to events. So I think the challenge of leadership, in part from the president and the executive branch, but also obviously related to Congress and other groups, is how do you try to organize these inchoate attitudes to deal with particular problems? Whether they're biological security, climate, or more sort of traditional security issues. And let me again give you a sort of a practical little example. With the departure from Afghanistan, which I obviously think was not well handled, but at the same time, I wrote a piece in something called The American Purpose, where I drew an analogy to Nixon and Kissinger. So from their very first day in office, the impending defeat in Vietnam was with them every day. And it's important to recognize that retreats, whether military or diplomatic, are the most difficult maneuver. And so as you engage in one, it's often useful to think about where else might you take initiative. I had proposed that the United States actually step up to do more in the global pandemic and biological security, because this is going to be with us for a while. I also suggested some things on the economic side. But to give the administration credit, this recent Australian, UK, US security arrangement, and I just had dinner actually with the Australian Prime Minister 2 nights ago, is a good example of sort of making a move to reshift kind of to take initiative on things. So I still believe that the United States, that the public in the United States is more willing and to support, engage these issues. But there's a certain skepticism, there's a certain sense of frustration. And going back to the theme of my book, I'm a little skeptical sometimes of writers who just focus on grand strategies and designs. Intellectually, that's fun to play with, but in my experience, focusing on results, outcomes, accomplishing things, that's what's important in diplomacy, but it's also important in terms of building support on these topics.
Thank you, Mr. Zoellick, for the presentation. I'm very excited to read your book.
Good.
It's actually been on my Amazon queue for a while, so I was really excited to see
Good. Put it on your Amazon review, too.
So one of the things you said earlier is kind of prompted a question in my mind when you talked about how international relations is taught often at this theoretical level, or in my experience, also very niche, regional, water security in Jordan. But it's this sort of middle, be able to think conceptually, but also to apply problem solving. When you, in your career, when you've seen kind of masters at problem solving diplomatically, what did you observe in their heads? How are they thinking through problems using history in one way or not the other? Can you talk a little bit about how they thought through those problems?
Yeah. Well, first off, I encourage for those of you that will be teaching, read the book, consider it for your students. I found that with some of my friends who are professors at universities, the students like the book because, frankly, after years of sort of critical studies, they like to have some sense that people can actually solve problems and you get things done. And again, one of the messages here is, imperfect results in a far from perfect world, that's okay. I mean, and one of the lessons is that, you never totally solve the problems. Whatever problem you're dealing with, you're planting the seeds sort of for the next series of challenges. But there's perhaps a bit of an optimism in this, which is that as opposed to sort of looking on history as kind of timeless obstacles, you try to see, how you can make something better. But more specifically to your question, yeah, I worked for James Baker for 8 years at the Treasury Department, State Department, White House. And this theme of pragmatism, which for those of you who know a little bit about philosophy also has its American origins about, trying to focus on, as opposed to sort of dogmas or intellectual conventions, trying to focus on experience to get results. In the diplomatic sphere, it will require a sense of power. Which is whether economic, military, technological, votes. You have to know how institutions and processes work and operate. You might have a grand idea, but how are you going to get it done in a process? A sense of timing is often important and sort of comes out in the book. So these are some of the practical steps. One point that I'll draw out, though, because your question particularly sparked me to think about this, is what I call the operational art of diplomacy. And I talk about this a little bit in the chapter with Woodrow Wilson. In that chapter, I focus on the decision to go to war in 1914-17. So at the level of visions, or sometimes you could say strategic level, Wilson brought a lot to the engagement. And frankly, he wasn't bad on tactics, if you but where he really slipped was the operational art of connecting the strategy with the tactics. And I draw that out in a particular example that a friend of mine, Phil Zellico, has now written a book on that's quite good called The Road Less Traveled, which is the opportunity that probably existed in late 1916, early 17, to mediate the end of World War I. And Phil has done incredible research about this, but from the German archives, the British, and others. You never can know for sure, but think about how the 20th century would have been different if they'd reached some negotiated peace. And the Germans were willing to give up Belgium, probably Alsace-Lorraine, other types of aspects. But what is missing is Wilson doesn't know how to do it. He doesn't know how to have quiet discussions, in a sense, get commitments from the Germans in advance. And this follows the chapter I have on Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, where you can see the contrast with Roosevelt's skill. Now, part of it is also, and this is another important lesson about the teams around you. Teddy Roosevelt didn't have much of an established diplomatic service, but frankly, he develops relationships with many of the ambassadors in Washington. They almost become part of his team. And he did select people that could sort of extend his role. Wilson has none of that. In fact, his team is actively undercutting him, whether Colonel House or Lansing or others. And again, without sort of deciding the might-have-beens of history, it's an interesting example about this practical effort about how you put things together. So that's one of the themes that I'm trying to emphasize throughout, whether it's if you look at Thomas Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase, there are external events, but some of it's basic, like he keeps his eye on the focus of what he really sort of wants to achieve. He keeps his channels of information open. He uses the politics of Congress because Westerners were in an uproar and threatening to sort of march on New Orleans. He uses that as a threat with Napoleon. And shrewdly, he sends Monroe, who was respected and admired by Westerners, to go to Paris. And this is an interesting little part of the team aspect. Monroe was nowhere near the intellect that Jefferson or Madison was. But he comes to Paris, and literally within days of coming, he's confronted with, he's supposed to buy New Orleans and maybe some of the territory around it. And he's given an opportunity to basically double the size of the United States. And at first he thinks, well, should I send back for instructions? And he realizes that the window could close. He has to take responsibility to do this himself. I'm not sure Jefferson could have done that. Monroe was a person who could make that decision. When he accomplishes this incredible treaty where we buy Louisiana for 4 cents an acre, he sends it back, and at first Jefferson's very excited, but then Jefferson has a pause because, as many of you may know, Jefferson's view of the Constitution was more limited. And he says, I don't have constitutional power to do this. Do I need to seek an amendment? And Madison says, no. We're not going to take the risk of doing that. We'll find authority to do this, trust me. But these are one of the reasons that I was trying to tell these stories is that you can even see this with some of the accounts over the past 20 or 30 years. It's natural combination for journalism or sort of for people who want to have a big theme that kind of just overwhelms it all. Think about your own life or your own context. It's much more messy, right? And the practicalities of how these work. So that's what I was trying to convey to people to think about as they consider a new generation of issues.
Thank you. I can't stand up. June Teufel-Dreyer from the University of Miami. Thank you for a great speech. I'm really looking forward to the book. As you spoke, I had a question. You mentioned opinion polls, like the University of Chicago one, and I tend to be very distrustful of these because the answer that they want is implicit in the question. So 68% support NATO, but what if they have said, do you support NATO if it means intervention in Ukraine? Or 78% say we've got to protect Taiwan, and then, but does that mean war with China?
Right.
How do you operationalize this, and should we not be more skeptical of these polls?
Well, frankly, after the past elections, I think everybody ought to be skeptical of polls. I certainly a little bit more. It's an excellent point. And it was the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. What I tried to emphasize is the sort of the inchoate nature. It's more of an attitudinal, and it can shift, okay? So to take a very live example, in fact, as I was coming here, I was reading a poll that has the American public shift towards not only having Taiwan in the UN, but also its independence. Well, if you then talk about, are you willing to go to war with China for this? Which, to be honest, I think you would have to. Will that have a different sort of dimension? Of course it must. And you're exactly right, as pollsters know, that the phraseology matters. That's why, however, though, it's interesting to look at this in a time series. And you can see sort of general attitudes on topics. But it really comes back, it's the importance of the fourth tradition. There's an important role here for political leaders in terms of how they take that general attitude and shape it. I mean, FDR was a master of this. I mean, you could see, you know, in the late 30s, you know, Franklin Roosevelt gives this quarantine speech where he's trying to push the public to be more aware of the danger in Europe. He gets a very negative reaction and kind of he pulls back. And, you know, and Abraham Lincoln had a wonderful phrase about, you know, with public opinion is everything in this country. And if it backs you, you know, you can be successful. If not, you won't. And look at his whole policy towards emancipation or other, you know, aspects during the course of the Civil War. In one of the incidents that I deal with Lincoln is in late 1861, an American naval officer somewhat aggressively boards a British ship and takes off some Confederate commissioners headed for Europe, and it almost creates war. I mean, Britain was really ready to go to war. One interesting little piece for those of you that enjoy seeing films about the royal family, it turns out that Prince Albert just suggests some guidance in the note to the United States to tone it down a little bit. And he's dying of typhoid. He dies within a couple of weeks. It was a critical step that Seward, when he gets the letter, sort of sees that there's a face-saving effort. But Lincoln and Seward basically, while there's a public uproar about this, about sort of the British behavior, and remember 1861 was not such a great year militarily, they basically, Lincoln comes up with a very practical approach of one war at a time. Right? And he uses, but part of it is Seward finds this document that Madison had sent. Remember decades earlier when the British had been boarding American ships where we protested they're taking sailors off the ships. And so it's a wonderful case of creative lawyering. So Seward basically says, the British have accepted our position. You know, you shouldn't take people off ships. So, you know, now we've gotten that, we'll sort of reach an accommodation. That's the practicality of sort of bringing the public opinion with you. I guess, though, to kind of put this in a more sort of positive light, if you look at sort of American public attitudes internationally, even take the frustrations with Afghanistan, American public was engaged with this for 20 years. Yeah? And I think, you know, in trying to understand sort of American attitudes, there's more support for a combination of American leadership. There's a support for American humanitarian aspects. There are aspects, and of course self-interest, that you can build on. And I think the reason I'm highlighting this is that I think we're now in an epoch where this is going to become particularly important. And if I could go on just 1 second further on this. When I mentioned this afterward I had where I looked at the 5 traditions and I looked at the presidencies after Bush 41. Somewhat to my surprise, because I lived through this and, you know, was part of the debates, in some ways, Bush 41 set the course on many policy actions for both Clinton and Bush 43. If you think about policy towards Europe, NATO, EU, Russia, former Soviet Union, Mideast and Gulf, North America, the only climate change treaty the U.S. has ever ratified came out of in 1992. I was part of the negotiation of it. The China policy, for good or ill, you know, a lot of the fundamentals were set for this one-term president for the next 16 years. But you could start to see in the Obama era, there starts to be, I don't want to overstate it, but there starts to be a bit of a sense of pullback and withdrawal. It might be the global financial crisis. It was partly Obama had a certain diffidence in his manner that sort of communicated things, a reserve. He would often refer to the arc of history. In my experience, sometimes you have to nudge the arc a bit. And then, of course, Trump is a very sharp reversal. It's obvious he wants to break with the past. And so now we're in another period. It won't go back to what it was before by any means. And so the types of questions that you're asking and people are asking, I think, will be the critical ones for the United States going forward. And my only suggestion would be sort of look at what happened in the past. You might be able to draw some insights from it. Yes?
I can just project for
Thank you. Gabe Scheinman from the Alexander Hamilton Society. We posted you for a book
Yeah.
talk last fall, which was a lot of fun, and we're using the book as the basis as a textbook, really, for a seminar that we're running for students,
Great.
so it's a great book. Two questions, both picking up things that you just mentioned in your remarks and some of your answers on Seward and Lincoln. So first on Seward, and I'm thinking of your first tradition, the North American tradition, do you think we should buy Greenland? So that's first question, which, you know, gets giggles, but is not, obviously is Trump's folly, Cotton's folly, whatever you want to call it. But that was kind of first question. And second question was, when I read Lincoln, all I see that comes out of it is actually Washington and Hamilton on this concept that the number one priority is to preserve the Union. It's in the Federalist Papers, it's in Washington's farewell, as you mentioned. And to John's question about concerns today about divisions in the Union, we focus a lot on, you know, what is happening in our society, and maybe as an afterthought, what others are trying to do to our society. And so whether that's Russian disinformation campaigns, Chinese United Front work, et cetera. And so I'm curious in your estimation about the history of external actors, of enemies, trying to actually undermine union, and how we should evaluate the current efforts that we see that, you know, going back a long history of it. Thanks.
Sure, no, that's a great question. Well, and just to connect your observation about Alexander Hamilton with your question, you know, one of the things I talk about in the chapter is how Hamilton was trying to build a system of power, but he approaches the British, as you know, and in a sense offers a strategic vision of a partnership with Britain that he can't sell politically. And this gentleman, Lord Shelburne, I mentioned, had a similar idea. It was the idea that the United States would fit within the British trading network, but you had to treat us with respect. We're going to be a growing power. Hamilton had this wonderful phrase saying, you know, we think in English, even though, of course, he spoke excellent French. And that's a partly example of kind of the need to sort of capture the moment with the public support. He, you know, took us another 100 years to reach some reconciliation with Britain. And your second observation about sort of Lincoln, and Lincoln is so unique in so many ways. I mean, he's just an incredible figure at the time. But in terms of national power, he was certainly willing to use national power as Washington or Hamilton would have, and you see that extension in lots of different areas. If you think about foreign intervention, well, the whole neutrality doctrine that comes out of the United States, you know, in the 1790s was because of the worry about the French Revolution, you know, upsetting the American political balance and going into the election of 1800. So this is not sort of a new problem to try to think about. If I jump to the more current period, my attitude towards Russian cyber attacks on our election system would have been much harsher than either Obama's or Trump's, because I think this is very fundamental. So in a way, I go back to some constitutional principles here, and I think that trying to disrupt our election system really goes to the core of our security and others. Now, you'd need a discussion with cyber experts about what combination of deterrence and offensive use and others. But I think the response has to be and will need to be in the future sort of firmer on these topics. And in today's debate, you'll see this around the malware issue, which I deal with lots of different companies. Having said that, we're going back to the notion of sort of, I'd be careful about using the phrase populism, but sort of reaction on issues. It's also important to remember that our strength as a society is our openness. And this is, you know, one of Ronald Reagan's sort of great traits in this. And the reason I mention this is if I think about the fears of the McCarthy era, or some of the responses today with China that sort of see, can we imitate the Chinese? I don't think that plays to our strength. I think our strength as our society is our openness to ideas, to goods, to capital, to people. I work with a number of companies sort of on the cutting edge, and it's just so striking to me how many of them are led by immigrants who came as children or children of immigrants. China's not going to draw that, you know. And so when we think about our universities, yes, you want to be careful about, subversion or espionage or others, but we have to get a balance here that we don't close off our strengths going forward. You know, some of the attitudes you've seen against Asian Americans on different things, that's not what America should or sort of can be. So I think to kind of pull that together, if now and then, you know, people will react sort of emotionally, they'll get fearful, and then it's actually important for some voices to sort of act and make a slight contrarian point and note the dangers of these courses. And you've seen throughout American history, you know, how we have that sort of swing. And I think that's one of the issues we're facing today as well. There's a part of it too, which is, I find a little frustrating, which is, I think some of this depends whether a society feels it's under a threat or have its own sense of confidence. You know, I deal with people around the world all the time, and one of the things I always try to remind them is, look, when you look at the US, don't just look at sort of Washington and government, because our system was designed to keep a lot of energy and entrepreneurial innovation in the private sector. And, you know, whether it be, you know, fracking, which totally changed the nature of the energy market 10 or 15 years ago, whether it be other things in the technology innovation, whether it be the vaccines developments, that's a key part of America's resiliency. And so with your sort of combination of policies, you don't want to lose that. And this comes back for the theme of Hamilton. Hamilton was, of course, very alert to this. I mean, Hamilton wasn't just trying to have government direction on policies. He wanted to create a framework and incentives for the types of American power creation that we saw.
Fortunately, I think we're going to be out of time. So
Well, thank you all.
this will be our last question.
And again, let me just close with this point. I'm really glad all of you took the time to be part of this. As I said, I think the types of things that the Rumsfeld Foundation is trying to create, finding people like yourselves that are interested in public affairs issues, you know, whether it's in your community, whether it's state, national, globally, that's critically important for the topics we've just discussed going forward. And I hope you also feel that kind of the interaction you have among one another, you know, it gives you additional insights. So a lot of what I personally learned going back to these questions of sort of practical sort of power or operation is what I call the peripheral vision. You know, it's connecting dots. It's seeing how things sort of fit together. And this is a great organization or group to help you do that. So thank you.